Sexual Offenders and Recidivism by Deanna.R.SEI. The purpose is that sexual offenders will repeat offend. Therefore, stricter laws are a must to deter a repeat offense by a sexual offender. My agenda states the purpose and the different categories that we're going to be discussing today. Under support and development, I wanted to start with some definitions as far as sexual violence and sexual recidivism so that you guys understand what those things mean. What is sexual violence? Sexual violence is any act or attempt to obtain a sexual act by violence or coercion, acts to traffic a person, or acts directed against a person's sexuality, regardless of the relationship to the victim. What is sexual offender recidivism? Sexual offender recidivism is the reoffending of sexual offenders who have already been involved in the criminal justice system. Punishment. Punishment differs both from state and federal. For example, under state laws and punishment, the laws and punishment differ from state to state. For example, someone who commits a crime here in Vermont may be punished differently than somebody, say, in California, because they have different laws there and different punishments for those crimes for sex offenders. Federal laws right now vary because every state is different, so the federal guidelines would be different based off of the state as well, as there's no universal law or punishments across the board from state and punishment for federal acts of sexual violence. Under development for rehabilitation, there are state requirements and there are federal requirements. For state requirements, it's mandated that after someone is released from prison, or if they're released from probation and parole, if they don't actually do jail time, they are required to sign under a registry. That way their name is listed on this registry as a sex offender. They're also required to submit a photo ID for the state as well, so that way that their photo ID actually matches in the registry system with the state and the government. As far as federal guidelines and requirements for rehabilitation, those are actually set forth under the original punishment when the sex offender is convicted. If any individual fails to comply with their state punishment, then they can actually be held accountable at a federal level as well. The rate of recidivism is actually very high with convicted violators. Someone who has been convicted of an offense is definitely at a higher risk of offending and reoffending than someone who hasn't been convicted, especially when their punishment was not severe enough in the first place. Recidivism is very high when people get out of prison. When people are convicted of crimes, they are given the opportunity to be compliant in therapeutic programs in jail. Basically, that allows them to figure out kind of basically with a therapist what's going on and how to work through those challenges. And it has been found that the ones that are compliant with the programs with the therapist and administrators are less likely to reoffend. It's definitely a lower level. And those that are not complying with the programs are actually at a lot higher of a rate to reoffend when they get out of prison. Megan's Law was inducted as a policy in place after a 7-year-old girl, Megan Kanka, was raped and murdered in 1994. This was done by Jesse Timendea. He was found guilty on 2 previous sexual offenses. However, he had lenient sentences and was actually let out of jail early because he was considered a model prisoner. He didn't have any problems in jail, therefore they thought that he was at a lower rate to reoffend once he got out of prison. He actually admitted to stalking and following this girl until he eventually raped and murdered her. Now, had the community known that this sex offender had lived in the community, the family would have been able to keep this child safe. This man actually moved across the street from Megan Kinka and her family, along with 2 other sex offenders. At that time, there was no registry that mandated that they had to notify the community that they moved into the area. Now, because of Megan Kinka's death, Megan's Law came into place, mandating it that any sex offender will be on the registry and that the community would be notified if a sex offender moves into that area. Some would say that sex offenders would benefit from shorter sentences or lenient sentences for first-time offenders, or no prison time, rather just have treatment opportunities. All of those are false. Evidence shows that by somebody having a shorter sentence or somebody having a lenient sentence or no sentence at all, that they're at a higher rate to reoffend and that their crimes are going to be a lot more severe and a lot more violent. In conclusion, statistics show that sexual predators will reoffend, and therefore stricter laws are a must. The current systems in place have no uniformity across state lines and state to federal jurisdictions. The punishments for these crimes can be often too minimal to support the statistical analysis for reoffending. Often the initial punishment for a sexual crime is too forgiving. The rate in which sex offenders repeat offend is very high. By allowing minimal sentences to first-time offenders, the system is allowing these violators to reoffend at a later date. If the law in place were stricter, then people would be less likely to reoffend because they would not have the opportunity. If criminals are given a harsher punishment after the first offense, it would not allow for a second chance to violate anybody. The states can also work with the federal government to have consistencies with the laws and punishments across the board so they're the same no matter where you live. The laws and punishments must be severe, as punishments need to fit the crime. Think of the Megan Kinka story and all of the other innocent victims that were failed both by their perpetrators and the system. All of the evidence proves that offenders will reoffend given the opportunity. If the opportunity is taken away from them, less people would suffer the consequences. And that's all I have.